Hello, dear beloved followers of this YouTube channel. Welcome once again to Teacher on YouTube Online Media. And today we're going to have a discussion on how to attempt this question, how to attempt this poetry question. And we have got a specific poetry question today. How does it state? The question reads, by using specific relevant examples from your experience, describe the unique features or characteristics that distinguish poetry from other genres. In other words, how poetry differs from other literary genres like prose. How poetry differs from other literary genres, from other literary kinds. The term genres actually mean kinds. A kind of literary work can be a novel, a play, or a short story. Then how poetry actually differs from other works of art, like novels, short stories, and plays. This question can also be asked by using the following words. There is a pleasure and enjoyment in reading poetry, which makes it different from prose genre of literature. How do you differentiate poetry from prose? Well, dear listeners, I wish to remind you once again, for we have been having the same lessons here. Some previous lessons have been based on how to attempt literature essays. As far as this question is concerned, the first procedure when tackling this question is to identify some key terms, to identify some important terms that must be defined in this question. And the most important key term to define here, dear listeners, is the term poetry. Then, what is poetry? Here goes the introduction of this question. Poetry is a work of art that uses creative and imaginative language, which arouses emotions to portray social realities to the intended audience. A work of art that uses creative and imaginative language, which arouses emotions, which stimulates emotions to portray social realities to the intended audience. Poetry, as a literary genre, differs from other genres of literature in many ways. Poetry differs from novels, plays, and short stories in many ways. And this essay discusses some of the unique features of poetry that actually differentiate poetry from other works of art like plays, novels, and short stories. Dear listeners, this was the introduction. How can you actually construct a very captivating introductory paragraph, a very interesting introduction? Try to present some necessary information, some important information when introducing any literature essay. Well, here goes some unique features of poetry that actually differentiate it from other works of art. The first unique feature is poetry employs language economy. Poetry employs language economy. What does it mean by employing language economy by poetry? Language economy simply means the use of fewer words to convey a lot of issues. That is to say, poetry makes the use of fewer words but to convey a lot of issues. Unlike prose, or unlike some other narratives, prose actually uses long sentences that form paragraphs. They normally form paragraphs, chapters, and a whole book. Take an example of a novel, Spared. A novel Spared by Severin Ndunguru is actually organized into long sentences that form paragraphs, chapters, and a whole book. On the other hand, poetry employs language economy. Poetry makes the use of fewer words, fewer expressions to convey a lot of issues, to convey a lot of information. This is to say, words are carefully chosen so that very few words present much information. Very few words present much information. This is due to the use of symbolic language in poetry or figurative use of language. For example, in a short poem like The Dying Child, the poem the Dying Child, actually, we can establish themes like poverty, classes, irresponsibility of leaders, disappointment, revenge, and some other possible themes like disillusionment. Dear listeners, another unique feature of poetry is arranged in form of verses and stanzas. Remember, a verse is a single line in a poem, while a stanza is a collection or a group of verses, a group of lines that form a paragraph-like structure. Unlike prose, which is arranged in long sentences, paragraphs, and chapters in form of a book, poetry is organized into verses which normally group together to form stanzas. For example, the following is a stanza with 3 verses from the poem The Dying Child. The persona says, thin and red, skin and bald, the boy groans on the ground. Dear listeners, remember, as far as organization is concerned, in novels, novelists make the use of chapters and paragraphs. But remember, in plays, playwrights make the use of acts and scenes. That is to say, scenes organized together to form an act, while an act is compared to a chapter in a novel. Another unique feature of poetry states poetry is rich in figures of speech and sound devices. Poetry is rich in figures of speech and sound devices or musical devices. Unlike prose, poetry makes frequent use of figurative language, use of figures of speech such as hyperbole, personification, simile, metaphors, and others. But additionally, poetry has some sound devices, some musical devices like alliteration, assonance, consonance, rhymes, refrain, and prose, and so on. For example, a good example of alliteration is a verse extracted from the poem Building the Nation that states highly delicate diplomatic duties. The consonant D has been used at the beginning of some words in this verse. The use of refrain can be identified in a poem, A Freedom Song by Marjorie or the Makigoy, when the poetess makes the use of a repeated verse at the end of each stanza, and such a verse states Atieno yo. Dear listeners, another unique feature of poetry that actually differentiates it from other works of art is a claim that states poetry is rhythmical. Poetry is rhythmical. In other words, poetry is arranged in form of regular beats. How rhythmical? Poetry is arranged in form of regular beats that make it possible to be sung. For the poem to be sung, rhythm must be used. Some sort of regularity of beats that involves stressed and unstressed syllables. Actually, for the poem to be sung, that is to say, rhythm is normally used in poetry so as to ensure musicality. Not only music, but also to entertain readers of poetry, emphasize a point, and arouse the sense of music. Well, there are regular beats that fall on stressed and stressed syllables that make the poem easy to be sung. Stressed syllables, or some syllables that actually receive some sort of emphasis, the sense of emphasis, the stressed syllable causes rising sound, while unstressed syllables cause a falling sound. By alternating the rise and fall of sounds, the poet creates rhythm. On the other hand, some other literary genres, like prose, do not make the use of musical feature like rhythm. They do not make the use of rhythm. It is because some genres like novels are meant to be read silently and not to be sung or recited like it is in poetry. Another unique feature of poetry states poetry employs poetic license. What is poetic license? Poetic license refers to the privilege actually given to poets for them to violate some grammatical rules for the purpose of conveying intentions. Unlike prose, which mostly follows standard rules like punctuation, sentence structure, and so on, poetry has the freedom or permission to break or to violate certain grammatical rules. Why? To achieve a poetic effect. Look at the following verse from a poem Sunrise by Joan Maikusa. The verse states, forward they go. So it has been written in such a way, instead for it to be written, they go forward, it has been written forward they go. Instead of they go forward, in a poem, I too sing America, the verse I too am America instead of I am an American too. Away they go from the poem When I Say I Love You by Joan Mwekusa. Instead of saying they go away, the poet says away they go. Well, another unique feature of poetry states, in poetry the character is the persona and rarely bears a name. That is to say, poetry makes the use of persona as the character. Remember, unlike prose, which has many characters with names performing different roles, poetry hardly has characters with names. It is very rare to find a poem containing characters who bear out their names. With the exception of few narrative poems like A Freedom Song, most personas in many poems are named after their jobs, relationship, or the class they belong to. Example, in the poem Building the Nation, the persona is the driver. He is named after his job. Some other poems that make the use of characters include the dying chart, in which you find the mother and the son in that particular poem. While on the other hand, some literary works like novels make the use of characters who actually bear out their names. For example, in plays, a play Three Suitors, One Husband makes the use of characters like Juliet, Tangana, Abesoro, Mezoe, and so on, who actually bear out their names. Another unique feature of poetry states poetry is meant to be sung or recited. Poetry is intended to be sung or recited on stage. Unlike novels, which are meant to be read, and plays, which are meant to be performed, poetry is meant to be sung or recited. Poems are patterned in a way that they can be sung or recited. That is why they have sound devices like rhymes, alliteration, consonants, just to mention the few, which bring about music and add effect to the poem. Another unique feature, and the most important one, of poetry states poetry uses imaginative language. What is an imaginative language? Imaginative language is the language that appeals to human senses. Can be the sense of touch, the sense of seeing, the sense of hearing, the sense of movement, and so on. Poetry employs imagery and symbolism that makes the readers to dig deeper to uncover the underlying meaning. That is to say, for readers to understand poetry, they must dig deeper. They must identify some hidden meanings, some symbolic words, or some symbolic phrases that actually must be studied before coming up with the desired meaning. Poetry is not to, it should not be taken at surface. Rather, readers should dig deeper to identify the meaning. That is to say, some words carry an extra meaning. For example, in a poem, when I say I love you, words like little bird and honeybee have been used to mean girls or women. Dear listeners, the last but one important unique feature of poetry states poetry arouses emotions and feelings of the persona. Not only the persona but also readers. Poetry arouses, poetry evokes, poetry stimulates emotions and feelings of readers. Unlike prose, poetry appeals to the five senses, the five human senses, the sense of touch, smell, taste, sight, and sound. And the poem can move someone. When reading a poem, you can actually be moved emotionally, and you can find readers crying or laughing. It can also make you annoyed, angry, sad, embarrassed, sympathetic, or amused. It depends on the nature of the poem's subject matter. For example, the poem If We Must Die by Claude McKay and Your Pain by Armando Guebuza aroused the feeling of hatred against the white oppressors. The last important unique feature of poetry states poetry has the first letter of each verse capitalized. Poetry has the first letter of each verse capitalized, but in most poems. Unlike prose, in which capitalization occurs only at the beginning of a new sentence or proper nouns, in most poems, the first letter of each line is normally capitalized. This happens even when the sentence is still in progress. Look at the following stanza from the poem The Graceful Giraffe Cannot Become a Monkey, as an extract from Song of Lawino and Song of Ochor. The stanza states, "Listen, ostrich plums differ from chicken feathers. A monkey's tail is different from that of a giraffe." Some letters that appear at the beginning of some verses, letters like L, O, F, A, I have been characterized, for they appear at the beginning of some verses. Conclusively, dear listeners, however, it should be noted that the different features discussed above are not necessary to be found in every poem. Some poems contain some features and some other poems do lack the above features, but there are some features which are found in almost every poem. Thank you for attention and clear follow-up regarding this lesson on how to attempt this poetry question. I kindly remind you that this is one of the most important questions that are normally tested in different examinations. So I kindly advise you to keep on listening, keep on making a clear follow-up regarding this question, for it is normally tested not only in ordinary